this. Lots of people.
Laura Geller. Hi, Laura.
Mm.
Oh, Laura.
Oh, wow. Lots of people coming in.
Someone say hi to.
I can't keep up. It's going so fast.
Oh.
I know.
Oh, yeah, I know. Another
So many wonderful
Nashville.
people
Hello,
here.
Nashville.
Tilly Shamus. Hi, Tilly.
Hello, Tilly. Oh,
Nashville's
Okay.
Dedrick Central. I also have to say hi to Nashville.
Hi, Eve. We can't keep up. There's so many wonderful people there.
I'm turning off the chat. I can't even look. It's too much. It's
How many
overwhelming.
people are-
Hey, Bella Abzug's daughter's here.
Oh.
Okay, so I promise
Oh.
there's too many wonderful people here. That is pretty cool. So there are so many wonderful people here. We're not going to be able to greet everybody who we are very happy to see, but we love having people introducing themselves. Oh, there's a delay of the YouTube somehow here. It's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight. We are more than 430 people already. It's wonderful to see so many people pouring in and introducing themselves in the chat, and to see that we're coming in from all over the place. Lots of people that we know and people that we don't know. So this is really wonderful. Welcome everybody to this conversation about Mrs. America, Feminism Then and Now. Oh, we just lost Joyce. Hosted by the Jewish Women's Archive. I am Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. And for those of you who don't know JWA, we are a digital archive that helps expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We draw on the richness of our history for insight about the world today, and I'm excited for us to be doing that tonight together. So I encourage you to check out jwa.org if you haven't before, and even if you have, you'll always find new things there. This is only one of many different projects and resources that we offer. There's always something to learn, and it's a really fun place to lose yourself and dive into the historical record. I am really excited to be with all of you tonight and to be with these illustrious panelists. As I said before, keep introducing yourself in the chat box. We love to see who's with us. We already have more than 460 people. I also encourage you to put your questions in the chat box, and I will draw from those over the course of our conversation. So those of you who know me know that I'm a historian of women and social movements. So I get very excited and a little bit scared when I hear about cultural representations of feminism. I believe that history is relevant and inspiring because it teaches us about the world and our place in it, and most importantly, how we can make change in the world. And for that reason, I really see popular culture as more than entertainment. I mean, of course, we entertain ourselves by watching shows like Mrs. America, but it's also about how we learn how to make change in the world. And that's why the stakes are high. And I'm sure you'll hear some of that heat tonight in our conversation. At JWA, we really believe in the power of stories, because stories are the best way that we can understand ourselves and learn about others. And as Gloria Steinem herself said, each other's lives are our best textbooks. And we really believe that, and in fact, stake our work on that belief. So I'm really excited tonight to learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. We will be each other's textbooks. We'll be talking about the historical moment that's depicted in Mrs. America, and also the historical moments that we are living through today. So that's my brief introduction, but I'm very excited to introduce you to the wonderful people that we have here with us tonight. Letty Cotton Pogrebin is the founding editor of Ms. Magazine and a pioneering feminist activist and writer. She's the author of 12 books, including the groundbreaking Jewish feminist work, Deborah, Golda, and Me. And Letty, I don't know if you remember this, but I actually read that book my freshman year of college and came down to New York to interview you, which was like a huge highlight for me in my budding feminism. Joyce Antler is a professor emerita of American Jewish history and culture and of women's gender and sexuality studies at Brandeis, and the author of many wonderful books, including most recently Jewish Radical Feminism, Voices from the Women's Liberation Movement. And before becoming a historian, Joyce was a historical playwright, which she will have some things to say about tonight as we talk about portraying history and culture. Jen Dederick is the author of She the People, a graphic history of uprisings, breakdowns, setbacks, revolts, and enduring hope on the unfinished road to women's equality. And she is also the founder of the Equal Rights Amendment page on Facebook, where there's a lot of great and exciting conversation always happening. So check that out.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, last but not least, Samira Mehta is assistant professor of women and gender studies and of Jewish studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She is the author of Beyond Chrismaka, the Christian-Jewish interfaith family in the United States. And her research and teaching focus on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender. So lots to say about that in this show as well. So thank you all of us for being with us here tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
Yes.
So I thought that we'd start by talking about a little bit about some of the intergenerational responses to this show. And one of the things that I found as I've talked about this show with folks and actually watched it with my own kids who are 13, is that people have very different perspectives on it based on whether they lived through the experience, what their particular memories or knowledge of it are. And so I thought maybe we'd start there with a little bit of how the lens through which we're each viewing this experience based on our own kind of personal relationship with this history. I think we're going to start with those of us whose experience of this is not quite as personal because we were either younger or not yet born when these events were happening. And then we can talk about some of the experience of what it is to see your own life reflected on screen. Samira, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think that for me, being a historian, mostly by training, I come to something like this and I am not expecting it to be nonfiction, right? Like, because of the nature of drama. And so I get excited if it tells a compelling story that I think will draw people in and cause them to want to learn more about something. But I at least personally find that my enjoyment is heightened when it's something I don't know a lot about, right? So there are lots of things about the series that I enjoy because I think it's telling a compelling story. But there are also places where there are tensions, right? There are inaccuracies in depiction. There are things that I'm concerned about that because I study contemporary American history, if it were a show about the Tudors, to pick a different historical drama, would not necessarily bother me because I'm much farther, of course, removed in time, but B, I'm not a early modern English historian, right? And so I think that tension is there. But I was discussing with my colleague, Sherry Rabin at Oberlin College, and she was talking about how valuable having a story that will draw in younger generations and ask them to ask questions about a historical moment. That these stories do that kind of work. And I think I appreciate that aspect of what happens in Mrs. America.
Well, I grew up, I was born in 1970. So right at the beginning, sort of 5 years after all of this starts and these progresses start. And my mother was League of Women Voters. She dressed up as Susan B. Anthony in the bicentennial parade, and I watched her on the League of Women Voters float, so it was a big part of my life growing up. And I think for a lot of, particularly the women who grew up with mothers who were part of it, and the boys too, the men too, that it was such an explosive revolutionary time that we were kind of left like, well, wait, now what do we do? You guys kind of changed everything, and then Reagan came in, and then it all went crazy. So for me, watching this kind of thing is very cathartic, and it's a very emotional thing. At the same time, yeah, I'm a historian and wrote a book of history, which I tried. My book is mostly accurate, and although I found some flaws after it was published, but that's another story. But that was all because it's very hard to find information about women's history sometimes.
And sometimes there's competing truths also. There can be competing versions of what happened.
Exactly. It's the Rashomon thing. But I really liked, and I did feel like this show is about now, which I think, which is, it's about looking at those events through the framework of now and how we got to where we are now, which is sort of complicated. So I really appreciated that. And I thought the acting was great. And I thought the way they brought up the various issues was great. And it was more of an allegory in some ways than a historical piece. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we're moving along, although Letty and I are about the same. So the show begins, what, in 1972? So I always show, when I teach women's history, I always show a news clipping of the march down Fifth Avenue, August 26, 1970. There were 50,000 women. Betty Friedan was leading it. And in the corner, there's a very tall figure looking, hair in the face. That's me. So I was, participating at that level at that time. But yeah. I see this series probably first as a historian. And I have to say that I think I stand as a strict constructionist on the construction of this series. I commend the authors and the directors and certainly the actors for the complexity of the story they're telling. It's wonderful to pay attention to these little known episodes of American feminist history. It's what I do with my life, so I'm delighted to see it. But I'm deeply concerned about what I would call the appearance of authenticity. That's, historical detail, factual accuracy, may be the case in small details and even in larger details. But what about the overarching historical narrative? What about the sweep of history? What about the meanings in this piece? And I think that you are the general, artistic community and the audience too, is in trouble when we mix up these genres and when we have this historical authenticity by appearance only. And Judith, as you began, you talked about the history lesson, that your children are learning and that you are learning and that others are learning. But what if that history lesson is incorrect? What if I'm acknowledging the complexity of what is presented. And I'm saying that in certain ways, it's important to have it out there, but could it have been even more truthful? I don't want to use the word accurate because to me, that's a very wishy-washy standard. I don't know how we measure accuracy. So I think probably I've said enough for now. I appreciate this series. I'm glad it's there. I'm deeply troubled by it. And I think there needs to be some correctives to it.
We have a question about what felt troubling, which I think Letty is going to address for us.
Yes, I will. But I'm seeing a lot of little notices of people who are having trouble seeing this, echoes and jumpy pictures. And I wondered, Judith, if we could fix that first or while I'm speaking.
I don't think there is a way to fix that. I think it has to do with each of your Wi-Fi bandwidth and probably Zoom also. Zoom can be a little bit, unstable in certain ways. So I don't think there's anything that we can do for that, except just to, if there are other people in your homes who are watching things on your line, then maybe kick them off. But otherwise, I think we're just at the mercy of the Wi-Fi gods and the Zoom gods.
Okay, Mom, get off the Wi-Fi and come downstairs.
That's right. This is priority. It's priority.
I'm in a sort of weird position. Watching this is very painful to me because I knew everybody in it very well except for Phyllis Schlafly. I met Phyllis Schlafly once in the green room at the Today Show. It was memorable because she appeared, her physicality was a metaphor for who she is. Her front was perfect and the back of her was a mess. Her skirt was all wrinkled and her bun was a rat's nest. And I always felt, she presents very differently from who she is. And that was my metaphor for her. But I knew everybody else. And I knew, obviously, I know Gloria intimately. I knew Bella. She was a dear friend. It's hard, therefore, not to say to you, when history is warped by character, then, I can't speak as a historian, but I can say that the characters as presented do not represent the real people who lived this history, who made this history. There is obviously a need when you're sort of truncating two decades into nine episodes, there's obviously a need to create a little bit of caricature. But where Gloria Steinem is concerned, to me, it's the alarm bells are clanging, because Gloria is presented as a kind of wispy powerhouse, if you can be such a thing, wimpy powerhouse. She's a contradiction in the sense that you don't understand her humility. You don't see it because there's a misrepresentation of our non-hierarchical setup at Ms. to begin with. So you see her asking people to make phone calls for her, which she never would have done. You see her as if she's got a private office. She did not. When you misrepresent a character in spatial ways, in terms of the physical and the aesthetic, she's got the long nails. She has the aviator glasses and the big hairdo down her front with the glasses tucked in. All that is, the verisimilitude is admirable. But when you don't see Gloria organizing, the only scene in this, and I don't want to get into the weeds for people who haven't watched it, but I will say that one of Gloria's great talents, and the reason why she is such a monumental figure in the movement, is that she knew how to organize without taking power. Phyllis, as you could see, was a unidimensional power monger. Phyllis Schlafly was the Eagle Forum, was the anti-ERA movement. It's very hard to think of another name associated, whereas Gloria was always pushing people upstage. And you have a scene in the series where you see Gloria taking the vote of a lot of women sitting on the floor deciding what to do about a particular resolution at the Houston conference in 1977. That's the only real moment for me of how Gloria operated. The rest of it is she wafts in, she wafts out, she says something witty and clever, she smiles, she looks uncomfortable, she has a sex scene, you know, she kisses a black guy a lot, which makes you sort of feel that the makers of the film are saying libbers were into interracial relationships, you know, without saying it. There was such an imbalance of who she is and what she accomplished, and her strategic brilliance, and her ability to sort of think through tactically where the movement should go and what might galvanize people and how to make coalitions. All of that is missing. So for me, Gloria refuses to watch it. People are asking her all the time. The makers of it obviously would love the publicity of having Gloria even protest, but she refuses to watch it. And I can understand why, just how I would feel were I in her place. I'll say one or two things about the others. Betty Friedan. Betty is actually a more sympathetic figure in the series than she was in life. She was a kind of a tank, you know. She came into a room and she was very demanding. She was raucous and impolite and imperious. The series did a nice job of showing that she was not a happy woman and that she had an experience with anti-Semitism that marked her. She also wasn't a beautiful woman. And I think I've said before that I think of her as Salieri in Mozart's time, you know. Gloria happens to be the Mozart and Betty is the Salieri. And without a Gloria, Betty would have been undisturbed at the very top of the peak. But with Gloria, she was always, I think, looking over her shoulder and wondering, why is she getting all this attention when I started this movement way back in 1963 when I published The Feminine Mystique, and in 1966 when I founded Now. She was very much an I person and Gloria was a we person. One final word about Bella. She, I think, comes out best, not only because the actress Margot Martindale studied her every gesture. I mean, the set of her shoulders, the twinkle in her eye. The hats are not right. The hats are, Bella would have been angry at the hats because they're not as fine as hers. She was a hat aficionado. But she gets Bella's presence, Bella's commanding nature, Bella's kind of mischievousness. She's somebody who, there's a scene where Bella is accused of throwing something, and it turns out she admits, it was only coleslaw.
Yeah.
But she does that. So characterologically, I was always comparing the actress with the person, and maybe that makes me biased against.
May I just say one thing about this last point about Bella, Letty? Because while I agree with everything that you've said before, the portrayal of Bella really upsets me. I think that is, 100% off base in terms of her politics.
Oh, yeah. I was only talking about the physical.
Okay, the physical, but I mean,
Physical,
Bella
verbal.
there is not
I think
Bella.
it's interesting, so that Letty, that you brought up Amadeus, because the Amadeus itself, the musical, the musical, the play, was itself inaccurate in terms of their relationship, right? But that becomes an allegory about, So it's sort of, I think I can't even imagine what it's like to watch them, and it's like, wait, that's my. I mean, the only thing is, like, I know, like, Susan Orlean, and you watch adaptation, and you're like, that's not Susan at all, So and so it's very weird anytime you see anyone who being portrayed fictionally, right?
I agree
Right.
with Joyce, though, totally
And
about
I think that speaks to the fact that
Yeah.
that the show isn't really made. It's made to introduce people to something that they haven't known necessarily. But I can we dig a little bit into the politics being off, because we have a couple of questions about that, and then I want to talk a little bit about Houston too.
There are a couple of things that I wanted to sort of toss out. The first is, I was a little nervous that, and I wanted to just say for our audience, in case anyone is thinking either that Letty is speaking, out of her role as a really close friend of Gloria Steinem's, or as someone who, because of her place in, like, as a founder of Ms., that her take might on, like, the non-hierarchical nature might be off. I spoke over the weekend with somebody who had, like, a really, like, first job out of college kind of job at Ms., who would back everything that Letty just said. So I think it's really important to say that, like, young interns had an experience of this as a non-hierarchical organization, and had an experience of Gloria Steinem as someone who was deeply interested in other people's stories. That was what it was like to be, like, a kid in one of your first jobs working under her. And so, like, I happened to be able to talk to one of my honorary aunts who has actually, you interviewed her, Letty, when she got this first job, but she really backs up that viewpoint. So in case anyone is thinking, yeah, of course we think this about our friends, we've got external corroboration for that one.
I think also there's an interesting piece that I wonder about, if the makers are of a generation that comes later and that didn't experience this time. I think it's actually hard for people who grew up, and like me, in the 90s, to even imagine that kind of environment, because it wasn't really, sort of part of the zeitgeist anymore by the 90s. And so I think that there is a way in which it may have been just a lack of imagination on the part of younger feminists to imagine actually what was accomplished in the 70s, because so much of that didn't kind of take root, or was lost along the way.
Right.
And I think that gets to one of the things that is hard about watching the show, that I experience as hard about watching the show, is that in some ways it's a story of endurance. I think it ends with a sense, and we can talk about this, where it ends and sort of what the message is maybe for the future, what it's teaching us about this moment, or which maybe really what the show is about. But also there's a sense that it starts from a high point in terms of the feminist politics, and where it's going, and it's heading into Reagan and decades of right-wing activism. And so it was interesting for me watching the show with my kids, who were really excited to see characters that they had heard of, and that they knew I had met some of them, and they were like learning and lapping it up and feeling very energized by it. And I just was watching it, enjoying it, but also with this like ache in my stomach, like, oh God, I know where this is going. And in the first episodes, when they're sort of like, oh, Schlafly, whatever, whoever that is, and you're just like, oh God, no, pay closer attention.
Yeah, it's like watching a horror movie. Yes.
A little bit, yes.
Judith, your question about the history, right? I think that, speaking as someone who comes at this from the standpoint of, like, this is historical fiction, right? This is not real. I that's the place where I get really concerned. The place where I'm right there with Joyce in terms of an opinion is, if you're getting major pieces of historical narrative wrong, that's a different deal than inventing conversations. It's a different deal than imagining the inner workings of the Schlafly marriage. It's a
Right.
different deal than sort of caricaturing people.
I can give
So
you an exact
all
example that follows what Judith wanted to talk about, which is the Houston Conference. And that is that the episode about Houston has Bella refusing to accept a platform plank. This is a convention, for those who don't know about it, because a lot of people unfortunately don't. This was a convention as big as any Republican or Democratic convention. People from all over the country had gathered, busloads, placards with little sticks and your state on it and so on. And there was a platform committee, just as there is at a regular political convention, and Bella is presented as somebody who resisted the inclusion of a gay rights plank. Now, this was in 1977, and in 1973, Bella in the Congress proposed gay rights legislation, something called the Equality Act. So to your point, as historians, this is simply wrong. This was simply a way to kind of stir up yet another arc of conflict, which obviously the episodes need. Every episode needed an arc of conflict, and too many of them were ending in a cat fight rather than in a
agree with that.
analysis
Larger
of the issues.
There's a larger problem in focusing on the great women of history to tell history.
Yeah.
We put that away, 30, 40, even more years ago. And while it is important, while Bella and Betty and Gloria and Shirley and Phyllis were terribly important in the ERA and also the feminist movement that went alongside and around it, it's not the whole story. And to me, what's really missing is the dynamics of sisterhood that fired up the feminist movement. This whole period could be told from a different perspective. It could at least be mentioned in the 9 or 10 hours of history that we get. We could have some sense that there are younger women, that there are dynamics of a movement that are going around beyond these great ladies, that when ERA is not passed, there is something left. I don't think that the story of the 80s and the 90s was just of right-wing triumph. I don't. I think that feminism accomplished a great deal. I don't like the way.
I thought the series actually did a good, one of the things I came away from the series with was this idea of, what we've been talking about, what Jules was saying earlier, or we were saying, is that the Eagle Forum was Phyllis, and everyone had to fall in line under Phyllis and toe the line and be completely loyal. And we see these debates going on with the feminists, but they all come together, the end of the series is, well, we're going to leave the door open for the next generations, which they do. And as we talk about, so I think that maybe it could have been emphasized more. I do feel like it's a look at the conflicts within, within movements in general, and some how of the work out.
Right, and some of the dynamics, which I hear what you're all saying about sort of the things that are not correct about Bella, and Bella has a history of more radical politics, and in this show they sort of temper it and show her becoming less radical, or make the claim that she was becoming less radical, which I think was not totally correct. But it brings up a very interesting issue, which I think Bella was very good at, which is how do you work with a lot of different kinds of people and figure out how to make some compromises. She didn't actually make the compromises that they show necessarily in the show. But I think that issue of like, how do you balance your radical goals with trying to get things through in Washington, and the pain that's involved in having to make compromises, and the ways that people get hurt, and some of the messiness, which I think actually is very helpful to see that movements can be messy, and it doesn't mean that people hate each other. It doesn't have to mean that a movement is fracturing. It can be about trying to be real and also to talk about what is like really, really personally meaningful about these things, that you get the sense that these issues really, really matter to these people. They're not just something that they're doing because it's their job or it's their, flavor of the week issue, that it's really a lifetime commitment. And that piece, I think, comes through in a way that is that is pretty inspiring.
There's a wonderful biography of Bella that's fairly recent by Leandra Zarnow, which is called Battling Bella. And she portrays Bella as a pragmatic radical throughout her life, as a progressive with a social vision that extended not only to gender, but to class. And that to me is the real Bella. And to paint her in this corner of focusing on pragmatism without any vision, really, without any vision for social benefit, is why it gets it wrong. It gets Bella wrong. She's as wrong as Gloria. And I think that's painful because it does a disservice.
Leandra actually has been I've been part of a tweet group of live tweeting Mrs. America with Leandra. So you can look at hashtag Mrs. A History, and which they're doing right now, which I'm missing, which I feel bad about. But anyway. But she's been, so she's been speaking to that a little bit on Twitter, which has been interesting.
Yeah, who was it? Is it Gloria or Bella who lectures, Gloria or Betty who lectures Bella saying, what happened to your radicalism? Where have you gone since?
Gloria.
Gloria.
Since you defended Willie McGee. Well,
that's Midge.
Midge, okay, whoever said it, I mean, just to even put that out there is such a misrepresentation, because Bella's role in the peace movement, in the anti-war movement, in the impeach Nixon movement, all of that is unacknowledged. So you're left with the feeling that Bella lost her radicalism and became, weak and easily cowed and too much of a get along to go along or whatever. And that was not Bella ever. And Bella in China in 1995 for the International Women's Year Conference, there was nobody more powerful than Bella in terms of representing women's issues, way ahead of the curve in any international entity, any confab of its enormity and impact.
I think
so Bella was right to the very end, she was a radical.
So it's an important question whether this is a small misrepresentation or whether to paint a character in this fashion while staying true to physical caricatures and events that they participated in, to paint them in this way that I think misrepresents their vision and their politics. How serious is that for a history lesson? That's my question, really.
And the same can be said about leaving, or as one of the commentators wrote, that our heroes are the ones who lose. We didn't lose. We lost this. We lost one battle, but we went on to fight on poverty, on childcare, on rape, on female sexuality. I mean, you name it. The women's movement is alive and well. It's not visible on August 26th walking down Fifth Avenue, but there were 6 million people around the world wearing pussy hats. Resistance is allied now with the whole concept of a feminist. You have Reese Witherspoon is a feminist. Madonna is a feminist. Feminism is alive and well.
Beyonce had feminism right behind feminists.
So we've got a lot of great questions I want to make sure we get to. I know Samira has something she wants to say, and then I want us to talk about Shirley and race, and I want us to talk about religion and Christian and Jewish women in this too.
One thing I want to ask as we think about these portrayals of the left is, how does, in a world in which, this is a television show and it's a drama that's actually about Phyllis Schlafly in a lot of ways, right? Yes. She's the title character. Yes. She is Mrs. America. So how does that matter or not matter in thinking about the portrayal of the characters where we've been drilling down? Right? If this is not their story, but they are foils in her story, like, because it's not history, it's a piece of art, does that change anything about what we're saying?
I do think, I think and this changed when I was writing my book. I was working on my book for years, and then the 2016 election happened. I had assumed my book would end with, and then we had a woman president, and it didn't end like that. And one of the things I really had to make, and I'd already been thinking about it, but really focus on was the white women who voted for Trump. And who were those white women? Who are these women who would vote for Donald Trump to be president of the United States when there's a white woman running? right? And that who would so obviously represent them better. And I think that that's something that's, I mean, I think it's really interesting in the series when Phyllis compares the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment to the fight for suffrage.
Suffrage, yeah.
Right. And it reminded me of like the conservatives now who are like out there protesting against wearing masks, saying that they're just like Rosa Parks. You know, like it's like this, like what? And it's like how you co-opt these the radical notions, the people who really sacrifice things. And of course, the fact that Phyllis could go to law school, the fact that, you know, she could drive a car, the fact, whatever, you know, that she was all because of feminism. And so it's, for me, because it's for you, Samira, because you're the sort of religious historian, the Christianity that they define, in which they come to, and I mean, the one thing about the decades after that is Christianity starts becoming very narrowly defined as this very right-wing, conservative, Phyllis Schlafly and Lottie, her stuff, that becomes the version of Christianity that we're supposed to think is Christianity. And so I am very curious about like how, and now you see that swinging out a little bit, even with the younger white evangelicals. They're like, why do we care about whether gay people are getting married? That's not important.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the things that's really important to remember is in part that conservative Christianity is also not monolithic, right? So Phyllis Schlafly's Catholic. She creates an alliance with evangelicals. First of all, that's a huge, huge thing. It's like it's a historical anomaly in some ways. These are groups that have traditionally and theologically, and from the standpoint of polity, which means how you organize your religion, right? Like, do you have a bishop? Do you have like a church that is entirely independent? These are all of the like nuances that these people had to get over in order to work together. But they also have theological differences. So Phyllis Schlafly says over and over and over again, or her character, right? Like the character Phyllis Schlafly, I'm not against women working. Of course, women should feel free to work, right? If that's what they want to do, they should just also not be criticized for staying home. That's actually not going to be the position of some of the evangelical groups, because evangelical groups put forth a particular, not all of them, evangelicals are also not a monolith. And there are, as you just pointed out, more liberal evangelicals as well. But the particular demographic here, you're going to have people who see the family as the central theological unit and really see women in the workforce as a threat to that family structure. And that's going to be a shift that you get as the movement moves from sort of, as Schlafly starts working more and more intensely with an evangelical base. So there are compromises that have to happen there, and there are resulting political shifts. I think that part of what happens, there are lots of stories about where liberal Christianity goes. They're not super different from stories about where liberal Judaism goes. I'm not sure how germane they are right now to this, like to the conversation of Mrs. America.
But I think that part of the point that you're saying about, the sort of the depth of the Christian piece doesn't exactly come through, because in some ways the antis are depicted as like they would be feminists if they really understood what this was about, right? If they weren't trying to ally themselves with male power. And what you're saying is that actually there were other things that were going on for them in terms of their belief structures that weren't just about false consciousness, they were about religious orientation.
Right. And so Emily Johnson, who wrote a book called This Is Our Message, Women's Leadership in the New Christian Right, wrote a piece for the website Religion and Politics after the first episode. And I talked to her after many more episodes had dropped, and that was exactly her frustration. She was saying this show, basically you get the sense that they all have false consciousness. And they actually have very different consciousness, different priorities that are rooted in very real understandings of how the world work. It's not just, yes, there are absolutely people who are afraid that they're going to lose protections and they aren't equipped to enter the workforce. Although ironically, after they work for, the Schlafly machine, they are, but be it the Schlafly Eagles or later Concerned Women for America, but they really, it's not a false consciousness, it's an utterly different consciousness with very different priorities. And that's something, we could talk about what happens to Judaism in the show. But
let's talk about that. I would like, we have had a number of questions about depictions of Jewish women in the show. So let's talk about that. But, and then I also really want to talk about race and diversity in general and where the movement comes off in those depictions here.
Well, I think they missed an opportunity to put the Jewish aspect of some of these women leaders' backgrounds and experiences into a more robust point of view. I mean, we do get some food issues. I think with Bella, it's mentioned that her father has a butcher shop, and is it a fish bread or is it tongue? You get a little bit of that. I think there's some message of Betty coming from Peoria where there were no Jews. She didn't get into a sorority, if I'm right. So it's in passing. But in fact, Betty has said on several occasions that for her, anti-Semitism was a cloak for attacking feminism. She received bomb threats. She received hate mail addressed to her as Betty Goldstein, all the Jewish parts of her. So, and Bella too experienced, attacks on Zionism, on Jewishness. So this is not a history book, I understand that. But somehow the meaning of who they were as religious women, as people who cared about this, certainly Bella did in every race that she had, this was to the forefront. So I'm a little disappointed at the absence of the seriousness of the question.
I think it was at times a little bit embarrassing to some people that so many of the visible women spokeswomen were Jewish in the movement.
Embarrassing too.
And in all aspects of the movement. I mean, if you look at in the union movement, in academia, in the workplace, wherever there were loudmouths, holy troublemakers, a lot of them were Jewish. At the same time, I wrote a piece many, many years ago about anti-Semitism in the women's movement. There was that too.
1970, one of the pioneering statements, right?
Thank you. I'm not happy that I found it there, but I did 18 months of reporting and interviewed more than 80 women and others in the women's movement. And there is a bias against New Yorkers or people who interrupt. There are all sorts of code words for Jews.
Right. And that's really the one place that we see it in the show is there's an interaction between Gloria and Bella where someone says, hey, as if they're fighting too much. And they say, this is just how we talk in New York on the Upper West Side, right? And there's a sense that's a touchstone of some kind of Jewishness piece.
Right. I have to say, I mean, I do think that the Passover Seder is the most attended ritual in the Jewish community. Even people who hardly at all identify as Jews have Seders. And the message of the Seder is the message of liberation. So, you imbibe that with mother's milk and Manischewitz wine.
So the question for me, say the show on Houston was primarily devoted to the journey of the fictional composite character Alice, who didn't really exist. And in that journey, we understand the problems that she begins to find with Phyllis Schlafly. But that was 40 minutes of airtime. The creators, who I think did a good job of showing the complexity of a lot of aspects of these things, deal with the question of anti-Semitism and with the question of racism, not in very robust ways, but yet, a lot of airtime is given to this psychedelic journey of a character who doesn't exist.
But it's such a good episode, though.
It was
Such a good episode.
Yeah. Well, we did have hope that we would see, a Paul conversion moment.
Oh, right. But we don't. That's right, because that would be it was more realistic.
Doesn't have
But that's where we see the Christianity, right? We see the woman priest giving the communion. Yeah,
You like that episode.
I love that episode.
Well, one of the questions to me also is, in this
Yeah.
sort of, is it art? Is it like, what is the relationship to history? To what extent does a composite character get out of some of the problems of misrepresentation of historical characters? And like, I'm really asking Joyce, like, as someone who has been in the business of like writing the historical, like, does it work? Is it a better solution or is it a worse solution?
I would say that it is a worse solution. It's mixing apples and oranges, fact and fiction. You get a historical narrative that is somehow, I may be, on the right on this, or as I said, a strict constructionist. We're not clear. I mean, the history lesson gets a little murky. And I think there's plenty of room for invention. There are various ways to use imagination and tell history from that perspective. I should mention that, maybe people don't know this, but I started as a historian, as a historical playwright, as a historical dramatist, because I thought that was the best thing to do with history, is to put it in ways that tell stories. And so I'm very interested in narrative. And I think that, notes could help. Perhaps if this were accompanied by some guide that viewers could understand where the fiction comes in and where it is not, I think that would be kind of.
If it was PBS, it would have been. PBS would have included a guide.
You're right.
So let's turn to race, because race is really important here, and it's really important that Shirley appears in it, and there's a lot of conversation around how race is dealt with, how accurate the depiction is. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, Margaret Sloan, who is the Black editor that you see in the Ms. office, is the one who says that there's a very pluralistic spectrum among Black people. We're not all one thing, and then talks about being sort of either made invisible or some such. And then somebody says, "Did you feel that way here?" You remember that? Somebody says, meaning here, meaning at Ms. And the discussion just stops when she says, no, not here. So you get the feeling she's uncomfortable, but you also get the feeling that we didn't discuss it. Let me tell you, we would never have let a line like that go by. Neither would any feminist in that era. And I want to say here about intersectionality that I have often felt when people raise it as if I'm a sitting dog who's being asked to sit. Because throughout my experience with the movement, not just at Ms., but all the different groups through the 70s and early 80s, which I say was sort of my highlight years. I don't want to call it waves. Intersectionality took the form of, do we have representation? Can we create a coalition with the National Black Feminists? Can we find a way to get a speaker who will stand side by side on this issue? We were constantly aware of the intersectionality of oppressions and of the need to integrate issues and to braid together constituencies. Because it wasn't in the newspaper and people weren't writing books about it, it didn't exist. The tree didn't fall in the forest. Those efforts were unacknowledged, except if you go back and you read old issues of Ms. Magazine, and you will see a head-on effort to face down these very same issues, to face our own racism, to face our own insensitivities, to deal with it in consciousness raising. You just can't say it didn't happen or that it was invented by, I forgot her name, the law school professor.
Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw. So I'm sorry to be defensive about that, but it does stick in my craw after having lived through such yo woman-like efforts to get these issues, front and center.
And again, just sort of in terms of corroborating, right? Because this isn't, I can't speak to this. This is, I was born in 1978. So the show and I don't overlap.
It was sort of fun.
Missed it. wasn't there. But 2 years ago, there was a piece by cultural critic Rebecca Carroll talking specifically about her relationship with Gloria Steinem. And Rebecca Carroll is a Black feminist and writes very much about issues of race, and writes about Gloria Steinem really as a model for what it means to be both a white mentor and ally of a Black woman, but also about her like as a person and as a character. And I think that much of what's really important in what Letty just said is that it isn't the great woman version of history, but in terms of the great woman, Gloria Steinem in particular, I think is someone who is very good at, because of her dedication to other people's stories, doing really important intersectional work of amplifying the voices of women that she works with across racial lines. And you really see that in some of the things that people have written about her and about their experiences.
I mean, I think in doing research on this kind of thing, you definitely see how, Gloria Steinem she says, and she brings a Black woman on stage and shares the stage with her, and then the press only talks about her, or and you can see, I mean, it's like how we still have a press that's run by white guys who are like the things who don't always necessarily even see their bias. They just think my view is neutral and everything else. And so if I don't find this other woman compelling, she's not actually compelling. Right. And so you see over and over again, Gloria Steinem trying to say, and you see this in the play, someone just mentioned in the chat, that play that's been off Broadway, her attempts to bring people in all the time. But because she's beautiful and she's young and all that, the Gloria, a life, people keep mentioning it in the chat, and it's but she keeps getting attention, and so you can always see this tension of, the attention brings some change and it helps get attention to the causes, but it also becomes destructive in that, I'm always on the Equal Rights Amendment page. People are forever criticizing that I don't post about the Equal Rights Amendment enough, but I'll post some article about the Equal Rights Amendment and nobody likes it or shares it or anything. If I put a picture of Gloria Steinem, a little meme with a quote, it gets shared a zillion times. And so it's like, there's this kind of always this balance of people claim they want complexity, and then they want like the cool feminist who made out with guys.
And thank God she modeled that behavior. I mean, she never took a speaking date in the 70s alone. She paired herself always with Dorothy Pittman Hughes, who was an African-American child care activist, or with Flo Kennedy, or with Margaret Sloan, or I think even with Alice or Rebecca Walker. I mean, she just made the effort always to say, this is not going to be a celebrity night. This is going to be about women's experience. And she shared her lecture fees. I mean, what more can you ask? And the point is, I'm not speaking just on behalf of Gloria, who I really want to protect against libelous representations, but because she was a model, because she was so attractive and so effective and articulate, the fact that she behaved this way represented us in the best possible light and inspired other women in the best possible way.
And I think that she's getting, there's a resurgence of understanding that about her, that she's, I feel like, I mean, certainly, because I think, Samira, you're younger than I am, but then there's even younger women than you, apparently. There's a lot of women who are younger than me, but still grown-ups, which I don't understand.
So strange
Whatever.
how that happens.
I don't totally grasp what that means, but they're, I don't, and it's funny because I'm friends with Rebecca Walker, and we've talked about the complexities of having these second wave feminist mothers, and they're complex, but the younger women don't have, that's their grandmothers, right? And so they're just like, they're really into all of it. There's no conflicted feelings. There's no but you remind me of my mom. It's just all this I'm hoping, what this thing is, I know, because, Joyce of course points out how, there's inaccuracies, but I hope that the great thing about the series is I've seen so many, every time I post about it on the Equal Rights Amendment page, there's all this excitement, all these women who are so inspired by it. And I hope that it leads to more reading about it. Like, I hope that Gloria, a life gets more of a exposure because of this, because people want to know more about Gloria Steinem. They want to know more about Shirley
The trouble is, Jen, that Gloria would refuse to have the spotlight.
I know.
Double bind here.
So maybe in some way Rose Byrne's very understated performance was a way of embodying that desire to not quite be in the spotlight. I mean, she comes across as very beautiful, but sort of a little bit flat in some ways. But we still haven't talked about Shirley, and I think she deserves some attention here.
Yeah.
I think Shirley would be very happy to see how she was represented, because she was a purist. She really stuck by her guns, and what she did at the 72 convention, I think, was admirable, although clearly fated to fail. But you know, the Black men who forsook her at the very end never get dissed the way the feminists do who
Right.
forsook her at the end. Because there's an understanding in political life, which Bella was trying to embody, actually, although it was painful to her as well, that you, in the end, you have to, if you're going to get anywhere, sometimes you just have to get with the program. And we felt that way about Jill Stein. We didn't want Jill Stein to ruin Hillary's numbers. And they felt that way, the pragmatists among feminists and among African Americans felt that way also about Shirley. They were afraid that Nixon would win. Of course, he won anyway, you know, and McGovern lost dreadfully and shamefully. But they thought they were doing something pragmatic, and they thought they had to give up their idealism for the sake of beating Nixon. We know what that feels like right now.
Right.
But I think that question, you made a really important point, Letty, that, you know, that somehow women are blamed for, you know, moments where they might make a pragmatic choice over a choice of solidarity in a way that African-American men weren't held responsible in the same way. And I think one of the few things I've seen Gloria comment about this show was that her criticism was that the show makes it seem like women are each other's worst enemies instead of recognizing who our worst enemies actually are. And that there may be conflicts among women, but that's not the real problem. And
the end of her sentence, Judith, is when people accuse women of being their own worst enemies. Unfortunately, we don't have the power to do that.
Right, exactly. And I think that the show, I think that is a very fair criticism of the show. On the other hand, that is the often I think women do have, like, that's been very deeply ingrained among women. So I think it also is not inaccurate to give the sense that some people have felt that way. Even though it is not true. It's one of the ways that patriarchy pits women against each other. It's one of the ways patriarchy works.
Writers could have told a different story, could have enlarged the story, could have given more voices to all of the major events that are depicted. Like Houston, you know, when they come to Houston, sorry, when the penultimate, or it's the ultimate scene, isn't it, at Houston, that whole 90% of that story is based on a character who didn't exist. And it seems to me there were so many narrative lines that could have been told about the ways feminists work together.
I think,
yeah.
I'm thinking in the context of, you know, the woman who called the police about the bird watcher in Central Park, right, as being, yeah. And I mean, I do think that there is, like, white womanhood is something that's being explored in this series primarily, right? And what white women, I mean, the one thing that Phyllis Schlafly keeps talking about is you're going to lose these privileges. And you could see, like, that woman in the park saying, oh, if I call the police and tell them that an African-American man is attacking me, then they're going to be right on it, right? And that kind of the protection, or the perceived protection, that white women have gotten in this country has fed so much of the politics. And, you know, that's always the trade-off, right? That the white men would say, you're not going to get to leave the house, but in exchange, we'll provide for you and you'll be safe.
I was glad that the series was honest about how Stop ERA was really infiltrated by the Klan and the John Birch Society, and they did that really head on. I thought that was.
And I think
always was the excuse that we're gonna protect you from Black men in particular, was always the underlying theme of that kind of stuff.
And I think that brings us back to one of the points that I think, Jen, you made at the beginning, which is this show in many ways is actually more about Trump's America and the moment that we find ourselves in than it is about history and the past. And it's using that as a way of commenting on that. And we see that, I think it speaks very directly to this question of all the white women who voted for Trump and the ways that those privileges are enacted. But I want to end by talking about this question of what we can learn from Mrs. America about feminism and politics in 2020 and where we're headed, what we what messages we can take about feminism today.
Well, I do think the great things we see, we know for a fact that they did not take the country back to where women had been in the 50s, right? The fact that there are these women, women have just created this series, and that this is not, we didn't go back to that. And they do end the series showing, that not only like the Women's March, but they show the vote in Virginia where they just ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And I could see, I'm in the galley there, and I was looking to see if I.
And you've got your ERA, yes.
No, that's fine. I got that in.
sign
I
in the
got that in
back.
Richmond.
Yep.
That's one of the original '70s signs. I'm just saying. I got that from the
You're
down.
very legit.
I'm very legit. I got very legit from that. But so I mean, I liked it, and I loved the very subtly they say at the very end, the House has passed a resolution to end the deadline. The Republican-controlled Senate has said they're not going to take up the issue. And I'm like, oh, that's right. So you're reminding us what we need to do before November. But they also show us the pitfalls of, because we see the McGovern-Nixon election, and we see the Carter-Reagan election. And we see in both of them where the progressive wings are trying to figure out, like, how much compromising do we need to do to beat this person? And then we see Nixon wins anyway, and we see Reagan wins by a landslide. And then you think, well, and when Carter abandons the feminists, would it have helped if he'd stayed with the feminists? Would have, what did it matter? Reagan still appoints pro-equal rights amendment women to different posts. So it's all kind of bull, and he abandons Phyllis Schlafly. So I thought it was very interesting to see that, and sort of, and then they say, their final lines of like, leave the door open for them, and we're not gonna let Phyllis have the last word, right? So
I think one of the sobering aspects of the show is Phyllis learning that who controls the media, who controls the language, has a victory. And so there's something, we see it happening when she understands that you don't have to really do what you say, you don't have to be who you are, you don't have to do what you do, but if you tell the story in a media savvy way, then you're close to victory. And I think that's the sobering aspect of this for me, because, her side is victorious as far as the show goes. And it is because of this manipulation. And I think that's something that we really have to think about very seriously today. Who controls the story, and how do we have input into making this right?
I think one of the other things that I think is useful and helpful about this show in terms of this moment is the powerful portrayal of women on the right, that who are still with us. All of the women who voted for Trump, and to remember sort of how that came to be is, I think, an important thing to know and work with. How is it, and also to think about what's going on and what's important in those worlds. Not because I think it's the way to go, right? But because I think effective strategy involves understanding really clearly who your opponent is and what motivates them. And while I don't necessarily think that this show is any more accurate in its depiction of conservative women than it is in its depiction of the left, I think that it is helpful in remembering the depth of human experience there. And I think that's an important takeaway.
Good.
What I take from this series actually is very counterintuitive, and that is the prayer that all of the conservative women watching this will see what a hypocrite she was, will see that she had to have sex when she had sand in her contact lenses and didn't want sex, will remember the scene when she was asked to take notes, even though she was an expert on national security, and will question their own ethos and will say, I better start thinking like Alice. I also will always take away from this the scene at the bar when one religious woman from the Phyllis Schlafly side and one religious woman from now, but we don't know she's from now, find so much to talk about, and their kids and their housekeeping and their cooking and God, and they hand to hand they make a prayer. And the minute that Alice, the one from Stop ERA, discovers that this woman is from now, she runs away. So she runs away from the commonality of women, the truth of women's commonality. And I think people are going to sort of freeze that frame and question their own self-inflicted divisiveness on issues that really bring us together.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to end with the last words that we hear from Gloria in this, which is that no matter how long this revolution may take, there can be no turning back. And I think that to me, that it ends by saying Phyllis Schlafly doesn't get to have the last word, and with a kind of message that the revolution continues, that message of endurance is really, really important. I think we all need this kind of culture so we can react against it when we need to and raise up the pieces of it that might be the messages that we need to hear. So, and then of course, as Jen pointed out, it ends with the ERA battle. I hope that more people will go out and make art and culture about feminism, because we need as many representations as we can get. Then we don't have to, the stakes won't be so high. We won't need to hang our hats on this as being the be all end all, because it's the only time we've seen so many feminists on screen. So I hope that this show is going to inspire people to be really creative and to dig deep, and yes, learn history and get it even righter. But I want to thank all of you for being here, for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate the audience that has asked so many good questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. It's really very hard to do that in a short amount of time. I want to thank all of the panelists for just bringing such great insights and brilliance and intelligence to this, and also for being feminists who are out there doing the work and teaching us. And for some of you doing this over decades, we owe our freedom to you. Thank you so much for all that you do and for teaching us all the time. So
they will.
Thank everybody for being with us. I hope that those of you who are here tonight will check out some of JWA's other online offerings. We have a lot going on these days, lots of opportunities to hang out with us and talk. Our Quarantine Book Club has been meeting weekly. It's on hiatus in the month of June, but we'll start up again in July, so stay tuned for that. And next week, we're starting a new series called Leading Through Crisis and Change, Jewish Women at the Turn of the Century, which is a bit more of a history course. So please register for that. But until next time, thank you so much. Good night. Wishing you all good health, safety, and a lot of endurance for a revolution to come.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Yeah, that's right.